1 year since my former best friend ghosted me. XL. Just a few days ago, it suddenly hit me that it's been an entire year since this guy ghosted me after I did so much for him. I won't reveal his name, but this is the story of what happened. I warn you all, it's long because it spans a friendship that went over 20 years. We first met at 13 years old in 1999 in middle school. I just sat at a table at lunch and sort of became part of a group. That's when I met him. He and I agreed on so many things. Granted, he didn't warm up to me super fast, but by ninth grade, we were fairly close. Me and another friend did have a habit of small scare pranks on him, but we stopped after we realized we'd taken it too far. And then we became a trio. Our birthdays were all a month apart from each other. April, May, and June. And all of our first names were 4 letters long. It felt like we were the 3 amigos. All 3 of us were in special ed too. And it stayed that way till 12th grade. That's when he decided he was going to leave special ed and just barely finished high school with the lowest possible grade he could pass with. And during that entire senior year, he treated me like crap at school. But when not at school or talking over the phone, he was his same old self. He would even call my parents' house and leave messages of him doing his impression of Uncle from Jackie Chan Adventures. It was funny at first, and then it just got really annoying. Then when high school ended, he told me he was moving with his mother and stepfather to Idaho. I was sad to see him go, but it was his life to live. He had no cell phone, so I had no way to reach him, and he didn't try to call me either. Fast forward 5 years to 2009, and he was back. He'd moved back to Oregon for personal reasons, and we reconnected. Things were great hanging with him at first. We were the 3 amigos again with my other best friend as well. His coming back felt so natural. It was like he'd never left. All 3 of us were living similar lives. All 3 of us ended up on disability, etc. It was like we were just meant to be friends for so many reasons. But the red flags slowly started creeping up. It started with him constantly forgetting we'd made plans and trying to duck out. I'd call him one day. He'd say he'd be ready to hang out the next day. Then suddenly he went to hang with some other friends and passed out sleeping on their floor. He did this to us many times, and finally realized his error when we talked to him about it. That and he pissed himself while passed out and ruined his cell phone that was in his pocket. There were other issues too. He was constantly talking about his old friends back in Idaho and how he really missed them. He also ranted a lot about a guy over there who totally betrayed him. He ranted about this guy so much, I still remember his name despite never meeting the man. But this guy apparently stole an idea about something he had and then stopped talking to him. He also had a similar thing happen in grade school when a once friend of his just one day told him they were no longer friends and stopped talking to him. All I could think was that he had it rough. He was essentially raised by his grandparents because his mom is a real piece of work who was in and out of his life. He also constantly talked about wanting to start a company of his own. But anytime he ever took the first step in anything, he decided it was too hard and then quit so he could go back to dreaming and procrastinating. For an entire decade, I listened to him do this. I tried to help him. I tried to teach him how to write. He did 1 page and decided it was not for him. He asked me to teach him how to draw. I bought him a $10 thrift store coffee table we could use for drawing, and because he never had a coffee table in his apartment for some reason, he loved the table. But we only sat down to 1 drawing lesson, and during it he threw a tantrum. This was about 2017, so we were both like 31 then. He had a nice sketchbook, and I tried to teach him the basics I taught myself. Well, he didn't try much at all. The most detailed thing he drew was a face with crazy eyes. I asked him to draw a head around it, and he refused, saying he just couldn't figure it out and wanted me to show him. Well, in like a couple of fluid motions, I quickly drew a head and hair to the face. The second he saw that, he just got upset. He was pissed that I could do that. I said I could do that because I took the time to teach myself. He just needed to try it himself. But he just got angrier and asked if there was a faster way. I said there were no shortcuts, and he won't get better without drawing. Well, he wasn't convinced there was no shortcuts. Then proceeded to answer a timely phone call, and I drew a picture of him pacing back and forth in the room. He laughed when he saw it. I tried to get him back to drawing, and reminded him he asked me to teach. He wanted a reference drawing, so I asked for something I could draw in reference. He selected the Nuka-Cola girl in a spacesuit, and I drew her fine in about a half hour. He was impressed, and then never tried drawing again. I also tried drawing his online OC character for him, and he was completely unsatisfied no matter what I did. I tried drawing the hair as he described, even following reference images he provided, but it was never good enough. His OC character was some sort of transgender wraith goddess with super scion hair, or something like that. Another problem with he had no concept of understanding money. I was the only one with a car and driver's license in the friend group, so I became the de facto taxi. Still kinda am with my other friends sometimes. But friends help friends when they need it. He, on the other hand, couldn't or wouldn't understand that gasoline costs money. He acted like we could just road trip 100 miles without a care. He was also constantly broke from his rent, continuing to spike. So he couldn't eat out unless I bought his food. I didn't mind because it meant we could hang out. But whenever he tried to save for anything, he'd get a few months and then splurge it. Then would go back to being insistent he could save thousands to buy a better computer or start a company, or both. But I had to remind him he could barely save $50 a month. Yet he was not convinced for years to come. I snapped him out of his financial denial many times. When he came out to me that he was bisexual, I told him there was nothing he could tell me about himself that would surprise me. And it didn't, which repeatedly shocked him. But then he started saying he wanted to get a sex change operation. I pointed out he couldn't afford it, but he was convinced that health insurance would pay for it. But it's considered cosmetic, not life-saving surgery. He was in denial about this many times till I proved it. He was pretty upset about that. And then his teeth started falling out because he literally never brushes them. He broke a rotten tooth eating a custard eclair. I had to convince him to go see the dentist, and he kept putting it off till I drove him there myself. They had to pull 6 of his front teeth. He was convinced insurance would provide him with dental implants. We have the same state-provided insurance, and it only covers the minimum. And I repeatedly told him so. And he really wasn't happy to find out he couldn't get dental implants and got stuck with a bridge denture that he didn't care for. Then he was convinced he could save money by paying double for a bill one month, so he wouldn't have to pay that bill the next month and just keep the money. I said that wasn't saving money, that was moving money. Yet more financial denial I burst his bubble on after doing the math in front of him. At that point, he was only financially surviving because his sickly grandfather in Texas was sending him an extra $100 a month. Then after a decade, he lost his apartment in 2019. He couldn't make rent, got evicted and taken to court, and was on the hook for $1,700 for rent, late fees, and court fees. He had nowhere to go but come stay with me in the sub building I rent for my parents. Things were okay at first, but I live out in the country, and he's a city boy. He was like Mark Wahlberg and the other guys when Mark's character kept saying, "I'm a peacock, you gotta let me fly." And they'd tell him that peacocks don't fly. Well, he was a lot like that during the first 6 months. Only he kept calling himself a social butterfly. Then the pandemic hit, and he started obsessing about wanting to remodel my house with money neither of us had. He'd walk into the room multiple times a day to ask me the same question, but kept rephrasing it. Then left disappointed when he kept getting the same answers. He kept wanting to knock down walls, and kept asking me how much it would cost. Then he'd start saying, "Money be damned," because he wanted to remodel my house. He was living with me borderline rent-free. All he had to do was cover his half of utilities and help me with the cost of pet supplies and gasoline and vehicle maintenance. A deal he found very agreeable at first, till my car had to get fixed a couple of times. Then he kept asking me why he had to pay. Mind you, it was only like a couple $100 each time, and that's nothing compared to paying rent. He also kept telling me I shouldn't have to ask whenever I needed his help financially with shared items like food. But when I did ask, he'd pull a reverse and act like he shouldn't have to pay. I was the only one doing any cooking. He promised to do his share of cooking when he moved in, and only made hamburgers once. He also acted like he had cooking PTSD from having worked at McDonald's. He also at this time didn't have a computer, so he was always on his phone and would continuously buy TCH about people on Discord that he liked one moment and then hated the next. Lots of the same people in a viscous cycle he refused to stop. He also got mad at the slow Wi-Fi because the internet was being split by a lot of people. My sister and her kids live on the property too, and he would moan that he couldn't play Second Life since he didn't have a PC. But he had the money saved to buy a PC, he just kept refusing to get one. We also got in repeated fights over his procrastination. For over a decade, I heard him talk about wanting to start a company, but he kept refusing to take any initiative and acted completely insulted when I told him he was just mentally surviving off the idea that he would do something instead of actually doing that thing. All he was really doing was being on his phone and talking about shit he would never do. Then came the argument about the COVID vaccine. He literally acted like everyone in the world needed to get the shot but him because he hates needles. Then didn't like how I told him he couldn't expect everyone else to do something he won't. He would also find random things to be mad about, be they historical, biblical, or political. Meanwhile, I defended this guy to everyone who kept saying that he was being negative and crazy. My own mother some years ago acted like she had some big secret about him that would end our friendship. Turned out she had nothing and was just acted like she did. Anyone who dumped on him, I would tell to knock it off. At one point, my mother threatened to evict him because he told a small lie to stay out of a fight between my mother and sister. And I defended him for that because all he was trying to do was not be involved, and even threatened to leave with him if he was evicted. That actually scared my mother because this place would fall apart in a year without my help. Meanwhile, he was doing shit behind my back. He was griping to friends online about me behind my back, and even went to my mother while he was living with me and told her I was stifling his creativity. He only told her half the story. My mother called me over to lecture me, until I told her what the other half of the story was, and how he acted like we could afford to tear my house down and rebuild it, even though we're both on fixed incomes. She was mortified, and we were about to come up with a plan to deal with the situation when he just walked right in. And when we confronted him on what he did, he, a then 34-year-old man, nearly started crying. And he blamed it all on his family dynamic of wanting to make a house a home. We had to tell him he wasn't with his family, but mine. After that, he started getting more bitter with me. For one thing, he woke me up from a dead sleep in the middle of the night just to tell me about breaking news, and then got mad when I told him to not wake me up and save it for later. He ruined several nights' sleep that way. And then he was bounding in and out of the room to ask me random things so much that I called it yo-yoing. He was not a fan of that. It got to the point that in order to make him stop, I would play music he hates on my computer to discourage him from bounding into the room to tell me about every little thing. He once walked in with a big grin on his face and told me he massacred the entire population of Diamond City in Fallout 4, and got mad when I told him I don't want to hear about that stuff, because even in-game it doesn't sit well with me. We even got in a fight about Fallout 4 because he was convinced the character father wasn't the long-lost son that was kidnapped in the beginning. But when I pointed out every irrefutable detail that he is the son, he just got upset with me and claimed he was just being in character. Okay. And while living with me, he grew his hair out long and started dressing with more feminine clothes. I really didn't care. But there were rules. He couldn't dress like that in front of my grandparents while living with me. That was about it. One of his crazy habits was a love for shopping for women's underwear. And anytime we were at the mall, he'd try to drag me into a lingerie store. I really hated that. Then in summer 2021, he found a new apartment in downtown Portland. For some reason, he's always been infatuated with downtown Portland. From out in the country mountains, we can literally see the lights from downtown Portland at night. And I warned him Portland would eat him alive. And it did. I warned him any times to try and hold out for a better place. But he was adamant. While living with me, He also became the owner to a cat that we'd taken in. And his new apartment didn't allow pets unless they were a doctor-prescribed ESA. But he didn't need an ESA and acknowledged it'd be lying. But I was 50-50 treated like both the good and bad guy for pointing this out. He went to a doctor, the doctor gave him a note, and he got to keep his cat as an ESA. I used to think he was a good guy. I mean, he stuck up for me when his family wanted me to wait for hours outside in a cold car at 25 degrees on Christmas Day, just so he could spend some time with them. But he refused unless I was allowed in too. They didn't really like that, but finally caved. I thought we were so solid as friends, but he turned out to be a user. When he moved to Portland, he promised to get a bus pass, so we could meet up and hang out once in a while. But he never did. For months he kept telling me he hadn't gotten the bus pass. And then there was some of his stuff that he left in my house that I needed to get back to him, like the cane his deceased grandfather gave him that he was super protective of. We set a date and time for me to drop by. But he tried to bail when I was halfway there because another friend showed up and they went out bar hopping. But I made him stick to the agreed upon time because my truck eats gas. We used my truck to move all of his stuff, and I was afraid to leave it unattended for any amount of time in downtown Portland because catalytic converter thieves were rampant there, and trucks like mine were prime targets. Yet he always acted like I was being paranoid. I've literally seen tons of trucks and SUVs in Portland ads for sale because someone stole the CADs off them. It wasn't paranoia, it was a fact. Then last November we hadn't talked for a couple of weeks, and I realized he'd blocked me. And not just me, but my entire family as well. I did so much for this guy. I helped to keep him going for a decade. I took him in for 2 years, and then he ghosted me. He refused to tell anyone why either. Yet this is exactly the kind of thing he was super angry at other people doing to him. Anyone who did that he said betrayed him. And then that's exactly what he went and did to me. He's still in occasional contact with my other best friend, and I saw recently that he sent him a picture of himself in women's lingerie. And apparently he's back to thinking our state health insurance will cover a sex change. And he's got a social worker whose biggest way of talking to him is to use the word yes a lot. He's always been a product of his environment, and just a few months in Portland turned him into a complete stranger to me. He destroyed a 22-year friendship just like that. And with the 1-year anniversary of it hitting, well, I just needed to vent all of this. Apologies to anyone who read this massive text dump, but a TLDR couldn't do it justice.